Clinton, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for letting us use your house as well.
My pleasure. Glad to have you here.
So, elephant in the room. What are you sitting on?
A chair. It's a comfy one, too.
So, where did the bear come from?
It's a bear from Alberta in the Rockies. I like to tell people it's a grizzly bear, but it's actually a brown bear. It's more exciting when you say it's a grizzly, but it doesn't have the prominent hump that grizzlies would have. It's a brown bear.
Which tends to be bigger?
The grizzly, always, by a fair bit.
So did you buy it? Did you...
I didn't
out
shoot
its
this
innards,
one
or-
myself personally, but considering where I live, we do have bears in the yard quite often, and they are a staple of our diet.
Got it. And so, you didn't buy it?
No.
Okay. I won't ask any more questions. So, we've been friends for a while at this point.
Yes, yeah, quite a few years now.
Almost 10 years.
Almost 10, wow.
And this is the first time in about 5.5 years that we've seen each other's ugly mugs in person.
Yes, in a very different scenario than the last time we were together.
Which was when?
It would have been in the seminary in Dillon, Virginia, United States.
Very different. I'm not as different. I'm not married. You are. Yeah, it's been a few years, in no small part due to rather imprudent authoritative policies that made it difficult to travel.
Yes, you
For a bit.
missed my wedding.
I missed your wedding. And I had no unimportant role in that wedding. It's a shame.
Yes, you were right there at the top. Best man.
Indeed. So, I wanted to do the interview because you kind of live a life that is not the most ordinary. Not a lot of people. Where are we?
We're in the Northwest Territories right now, north of the 60th parallel, in a landscape that most people think is a frozen wasteland. But it's
Which is actually what I put in my notes. I don't know if you saw that.
I did, yeah. But it's the last great frontier is the way I like to think of it, and it's one of the few places on Earth where you can go that is not completely tainted by what some would call modern civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're in the Northwest Territories. And I don't know how we ever became friends, considering the differences in the way we grew up, but somehow we did. But you have lived a life that is not the most common. You got a grizzly bear around your shoulders right now, kind of thing. And you've had some pretty crazy adventures that I haven't heard all of yet. So I look forward to hearing the rest of the story here. So I wanted to give the audience a bit of an idea of what that kind of a lifestyle is, because I think for most people, their exposure to that is going to be the Discovery Channel and, I don't know, shows like Bonanza or Gunsmoke,
Yes.
you know.
And most of what you see on TV is fake, scripted, set up, not real.
Yeah. Also, I think that your main motivator for the interview is to to give people an idea of why you are here in particular and what you hope to accomplish by being in this location. So we're definitely going to get into that. But there's a lot of other stuff I want to get to before we touch on that. So I hope you have time. So let's do a quick overview of who you are. So you're a Catholic. Excellent.
Yes.
Traditional.
Right again.
You're a husband and a father of 2 little girls with a 3rd child on the way. We're not sure yet.
Best thing that ever happened to me.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You went to seminary for a time, which is where we first got to know each other. We'll get into that a little bit later. You live off the grid in the Northwest Territories. You're a hunter, a trapper, farmer, gardener, tanner. Not the tanning that I do in Florida, but another kind of tanning. You live a mostly self-sufficient lifestyle. Mostly. Is that fair?
Mostly is very fair, and I feel that we can and are in a position to be 100% self-sufficient. We could be.
And you plan to live up here the rest of your life, barring some unforeseen circumstances. Would that be accurate?
That's correct.
It's about as accurate as it gets.
Yes. You couldn't pay me to move back down to where I came from.
So, why don't we just start with this? What was it that got you to... Sure, there were several reasons. What really got you to want to move to this area of the world? Because it's not easy. It's not an easy place to live in. You got Arctic temperatures at some parts of the year. What drove you up here?
I recently actually just came back from a trip down south. And before giving you a few examples, it's interesting, when I first moved up here and was in the north, relocated completely, going south was almost a treat. And when I say south, I mean going to the big city or to civilization and getting supplies, seeing people, go to a restaurant, all the things that are important to modern man. And after a year or two, it started to change. And when I would go south, it was kind of a little bit exciting, but no longer held that same attraction. And not long after being in the south, you would want to get back home. I would want to return home. And now this most recent trip that I did south just a few weeks ago, I didn't even make it more than 6 hours from home, and I already wanted to turn around. And I noticed that there was a shift in my head, if you will, from the way I grew up and the things I thought were normal to understanding that this is not how we were meant to live, and believing it quite firmly. To give you an example, when I was down in the city of Edmonton recently, if I didn't see it with my own eyes, even having grown up close to cities and towns and so on, I wouldn't believe that people were living that way. When I walk into a store, a Walmart, whatever, and I look at all the people and how they just seem so mindless and lost, I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it. So it was, in a nutshell, moving up here was to escape that and build a better future for myself and for my children, and bring back society in a small way, even just if it's in my own life, the way I think we were meant to live. And that is closer to the land, more land-based, and leave behind everything that society is constantly force-feeding you so that you never know who you are. You never really get to know God because of all the distractions. And you raise children that turn into often not what you would like them to turn into because of everything coming at them all the time.
So those are some practical reasons, and we're going to delve into those more later for sure. What about your internal compass? Why
Yes. Well,
why here and not, I don't know, 20
Yeah.
miles more south?
if we want to, aside from, well, why here, and aside from all these reasons just listed, I love the unknown. And here I can go up rivers, travel into valleys, and cross mountains, and it's all unknown. In fact, in many places, a person could be the first human to ever set foot. So I love adventure, I love the unknown, I love the wilderness, and all it offers.
At what age did you begin to marry the North?
Marry the North is a good way to put it. When I got married to my wife, I told her that I was already married to the North, but she could come along for the ride. So it was always in me, I would say, and I grew up with a very, down-to-earth lifestyle still, despite being surrounded by the world. But I will say I was somewhat swept away by it. I was much more likely to be out checking my smartphone than out hunting or running around with bad companions. And as I started to approach my late teens and into my early 20s, that's when I really started to shift, as if I was starting to grow up. And then I started wondering, who am I? Because I don't actually know myself. I don't even know what I like.
Yesterday you mentioned a book. What was this book?
Well, I was actually in school when I read this book, and I was not studying or doing my homework. I just didn't have the desire to do it. I was always like that in school. So I picked up this book called The Northwest Passage by Land. And it was a very interesting book because it showed a really different lifestyle, one that I didn't actually know existed. And that book seemed to have triggered something inside of me, because from that moment on, when I read that book, I started doing a 180.
What was in the book? What kind of things really stuck out to you, if you remember?
It was a group of adventurers, explorers, surveyors that were traveling across Canada by land a very long time ago. I can't remember the year, 1800 sometime. And they were going across through Canada when there was no Canada. It was just wilderness. And their struggles, the adventure, and the way they lived really just hit home with me. I was like, now that's living. That's probably what we were supposed to do. Not that everyone's going to run around and have adventure, but just the absence of the world and this connection to nature and things that were real, tangible, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Their everyday lifestyle and struggles, that appealed to me.
We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but can you give me one example of a major struggle that you voluntarily put yourself in the wild? Don't give away the good stuff yet, but give me something.
When a person's out in the wild and say you're camping in the wintertime and you're in 30, 40 below conditions, I sleep in my sleeping bag with very little clothes on and just a lot of sleeping bag around me, a lot of furs, a lot of blankets. And in the morning, you have to get out in 40 below, perhaps wearing just your underwear, and start a fire or get dressed. That's a real struggle. It's something that most people would find difficult to even impossible to do in temperatures where exposed skin could become frostbitten in minutes, sometimes even seconds, depending which part of your body.
And so you enjoy just going into the frozen wasteland and
I do. It makes me feel alive. Makes me feel alive, and it's okay to do. When I was running around doing all kinds of things as a teenager that were probably not right in the eyes of God, this is something exciting and fun, but on a totally different level, and it's not sinful.
Yeah.
It builds character, skills, and all the things that I now use mentally and physically to be a husband and father, a provider, a protector.
That makes sense. How big is the Northwest Territories?
I couldn't tell you the exact square miles, but it's large. It's extremely large. It's, I believe, 2 of the states of Texas, which is the largest state other than Alaska, can fit entirely inside the Northwest Territories.
Just to correct my American audience, I think California is bigger than Texas, but he's Canadian, so we have to give him a little bit of slack.
Texas is the only thing we think of as big in the States.
I can see that, yeah.
The Northwest Territories is a unique place. It contains a very large percentage of the world's fresh water. There are thousands of lakes. 2 of the largest in the world
What are
are
those?
in the Northwest Territories: Great Slave Lake and Great Bear Lake.
And where are those located?
One is located approximately 500 kilometers to the northeast of us, and the other one is also northeast, but more north, and it's about 700 kilometers. And to give an example, that's not even halfway across the Northwest Territories.
Wow. You've been to both?
Yes.
Which one is larger?
Great Bear Lake is larger by a fair bit. It's the largest lake entirely inside Canadian borders, and the 4th or 5th, somewhere in there, in the world.
I imagine a lake that far north and remote must produce some pretty good water.
According to the United Nations, whom I'm probably not a big fan of, they did a
They
study.
got a few things right.
They did a study on all the large and even a lot of the small bodies of water in the world, and Great Bear Lake won number 1 hands down. And it's the most thriving freshwater ecosystem in the world.
What does it taste like?
Almost like heaven, if you could taste heaven.
I've been to heaven a couple times. It's pretty good.
It's anywhere you are in the lake, you just dip your cup and drink. It's unbelievable quality.
I think it was your brother who told me that it's almost a how did he describe it? Almost silky. I forget the exact word he used.
Silky smooth, almost as
smooth,
if you have soap mixed in with the water as it runs over your skin. I know that from diving off an iceberg in Great Bear Lake into the water. Yes. After
you dove off an iceberg.
I did. It was in early July, and there were still icebergs floating around on the northeast shore.
Early July.
And I decided I would swim out to one of them that had floated into the bay. And after I swam out and climbed on top of it, I spent a few minutes and then dove under it.
Anything more you can tell us about that experience?
There were a number of Dene people, which are indigenous in that area, at a camp there, and they thought I was crazy.
I thought I was the only one. So that's far north. What were you doing up there?
I was exploring, and I also worked for the Dene band. There's only one small village of about 500 people on the shores of Great Bear Lake, and I was working for them, helping to bring in supplies from the south.
Okay. And this was your off time?
Yes. I've worked a little bit in, even though I'm a trapper and I have pursuits that I'm engaging in here where we live, I have worked a bit as an ice road transport trucker, moving supplies into remote communities during the winter.
For this Delaney community?
Yes.
What are the ice roads for those who don't? I mean, it sounds pretty self-explanatory, but what are the roads actually?
They're basically ice built over land or water or swamp. So even on the land, in order not to disturb the tundra or the soil below, they pour down water and they build layers of ice that you drive on. And then, of course, a lot of the road that you're going to be on is going over water, lakes, rivers, and swamps. So, aka ice road.
So they actually, it's partially man-made?
It's partially man-made, except for in areas where you're driving over water. Then it's ice that is just frozen in the wintertime, and they clear it and engage in helping that ice get as thick as possible in order to support trucks or the weight of loads.
So they make it on the land because there's no actual road?
Yes.
I see. So to protect the earth.
Yeah, to protect the earth, and if you were driving on just dirt or rock, it's not really a highway. You need some sort of a highway, aka pavement, except think of pavement instead of being pavement, it's just the same thing but ice. Ice and snow.
And the trucks are not going to just slide off of that?
The trucks are all chained up when driving on the ice road. So the route I did was roughly 350 kilometers, and we would be driving approximately 30 to 40 kilometers an hour, which is quite slow, and with chains on every tire. That 350 kilometers would take as long as 18 hours to drive.
So the indigenous people, it's interesting because I imagine that they've been there for a long time.
They have,
and I'm interested, to know how it was to interact with them and work with them, and whether they still have a lot of this traditional way of living, or if they've I don't know, you see images of people in the desert in Saudi Arabia with all their traditional garb, except they're wearing Nike sneakers and have a smartphone in the hand. So how was it? How was it when you were up there? What was your experience like?
It's very similar to what you just described. The traditional way of living is more an idea now than a reality. Unfortunately, government policies have not helped at all in giving these people a way to keep their culture and survive in the way they always did. So yes, it's very unlikely that you're going to go to any village in this Northwest Territories and find people really living off the land. That number is getting fewer and fewer, and the youth aren't interested.
What did you notice with the youth in particular? Did it seem as if it wasn't really much different from the rest of society at this point, or?
In Delaney, on the shores of Great Bear Lake, where the fishing is impossible to describe, it is so good and the fish are so tasty. More than once we were out on the lake and cast in our line, and there would be 3 of us in the boat, and we'd all cast in the line, and someone was supposed to man the net if you got a fish. Well, before we had our lines reeled up, we all had a fish at the same time, and you can repeat this all day, day after day after day after day. And we're not talking 2 or 3 pound fish. We're talking 6 to 12, 30, 40 and upwards. So amazing fishing. But to go back to your question, I would go to someone's house and the youth are eating fish sticks imported from who knows where.
Why?
They have no desire to be on the land anymore. The government has implemented a policy up here that every community has a right to high-speed internet and television. And when those things came in, it doesn't matter that you're living on the shore of this lake in the most remote place or anywhere in the Northwest Territories or the Arctic for that matter. You have the whole world at your fingertips. And youth, when they're given that, which is highly addictive, they don't want the reality anymore.
It's amazing.
It's
amazing
changed.
how you have people in that kind of, I mean, that's almost as remote as you can get. How far from the Arctic Circle is that?
Delaney is still hundreds of miles.
Okay.
Well, no, from the Arctic Circle. Sorry, I was thinking of the North Pole. From the Arctic Circle, Delaney is roughly, I would think, about 150 to 200 miles. So, but very remote.
So they're basically in the Arctic.
Yes. To anyone living south of the 60th parallel, they may as well be living at the North Pole.
That's just incredible because it shows that, I mean, the internet, yeah, but the smartphone is just, I mean, to go back to the smartphone.
The smartphone, the TV, screens in general, and what they offer.
Yeah. Kids and smartphones, it doesn't matter if you're in the Arctic. And I don't know, if you're in the Arctic, if you're not interested in that kind of a lifestyle, there's nothing for you. You know what I mean? There's nothing for you. I mean, if you live down south, you have options, at least for things to do. If you're up there, like if you don't like the cold, if you don't like fishing and hunting and that whole lifestyle, there's nothing to do, right? I mean, am I wrong?
You're basically right. Yes. There's nothing for them to do, so they just get in trouble or live virtual lives.
That's horrible. It's a shame.
It's not 100% all of them. There are still good people that are really trying, but it's a vast majority.
Have you seen other communities or families in the more northern parts of Canada that you remember as being still in that kind of a mindset with the land and their traditions?
I've met quite a few people that have the mindset and the idea, very few that are applying it and actually living it. There are some, but not to the full extent. I myself don't know anyone that is living quite the way we are, to the extent that we are. We are a community without cell service. In this community, there's not a house that has a television. We don't have any government services. The nearest real grocery store is over 4.5 hour drive.
4.5 hours.
Yes.
Is that the closest gas station as well?
No, there is a gas station in a small village about 1.5 hours away where you can get fuel.
Is it a lot more expensive there?
It's comparable to most prices that you would find. Not prices way down south where it's generally cheaper in the big cities, but it's not. There is a rebate for fuel in the north, so that helps a little bit take off the markups.
So I think there's about 40,000 people up here.
Roughly, give or take.
So about 40,000 people in a landmass of about, and we checked it, it's about Texas times 2. 40,000. And I think about half of them live in Yellowknife.
Half of them live in the only city in the Northwest Territories, which is Yellowknife.
Which is that big on the grand scheme of things.
Roughly 20,000 people.
But the city itself is this big.
It's not a very big city.
Yeah. So basically you got this with 40,000 people. 20,000 of them live here.
Yes.
Basically. And then the other 20,000 are just scattered around. Just to give a little bit of perspective on the size, I'm from Florida, And Venice, Florida. I don't know if it's Venice, Florida or Sanford, Florida, but we're talking this size ultimately, landmass. It has, I think, more people than the Northwest Territories, and it's just hard to believe that.
One city is more than everything. Up here, you can get lost easily. It's quite the landscape. Right here, we're sitting off of a mountain range, which is actually the largest, least developed, least explored mountain range in the entire world. That doesn't mean that there has not been exploration or some development, but it's very, very small, and more or less you could disappear forever and perhaps hide half of Europe.
Wow. Closest grocery store 4.5 hours away. So you stock up on stuff once in a while?
We do. We more or less eat out of our gardens what we grow, what we hunt, what we fish. As of now, we're really down to just buying certain luxuries that are harder to come by, such as salt, spices, things like that.
So, without going too deeply into it, because we'll get into it later, but what are the main staples that you supply by yourself?
Pretty much everything that we consume, we supply, which is meat, potatoes, some vegetables, some fruit. We roll our own grain, grind our own grain, make our own bread. We have dairy goats up here, so we produce our own dairy, cheese.
So you got eggs?
We have chickens, we
Got
have
milk.
eggs.
Eggs, milk, meat.
Really, we don't need anything from the store at this point. But certain items like salt are very nice to have, and I'm trying to think of other things that we would buy, and there's not many. There's really not many. Spices would be the biggest.
I guess it depends on how fancy you need to be, you know? I mean, you can buy canned beans.
Yeah, we
Things
can
like
also
that.
grow beans and freeze them, and really at this point sometimes I'll buy a watermelon out of season. We can grow watermelon up here, and I have done it, cantaloupe as well. But sometimes you'll buy some item, usually fruit, just as a treat.
Yeah. What kinds of meat do you shoot?
What we harvest mainly is going to be moose. That's our most common big game animal here. We also eat a lot of bear, caribou, muskox, wild buffalo or bison. That would be probably it for meat. Beaver, we eat a lot of beaver too. And grouse.
So which one makes the best steak?
Probably caribou, hands down.
Wow.
We also eat Dall sheep now that I think about it. We hunt in the mountains and harvest Dall sheep.
Are those the white ones that have the curly
Yes.
horn?
The white ones with the curly horn that Americans come up here and pay upwards of 40,000 US to hunt. And they live only a little ways from my front door.
Why does it cost so much?
They're considered a trophy animal, and the territory they live in is so hard to access, so difficult, and so remote that it just brings a lot of costs. People like to go out and hunt them in a certain degree of comfort, and so outfitters that take clients out there have to pay for all this comfort, everything from helicopters to feather beds, in order to please the clientele. And then just accessing the territory itself is probably the biggest cost. It's in most of these areas are very remote.
So you're talking helicopter or boat?
Yes.
Which one most likely? More likely the helicopter?
For outfitters, they're most likely using helicopters more than anything now. It used to be horseback and hiking. Nowadays, helicopters set you down pretty much anywhere so you can get to the animal very quickly.
So how do you typically get to these areas?
Typically, I go in on foot and I hike the mountain ranges. In fact, that's the only way I do it. Gun, backpack, some survival gear, and into the unknown.
Do you bring your dog with you?
No, not if I'm hunting Dall sheep. As quiet and invisible as possible, if you will. Dall sheep are extremely hard to hunt and very smart. And they have eyesight that is unbelievable. They can see you coming from a long ways away.
How many miles would you normally have to hike to get to these areas?
Depends what area you want to get into, but for sure your hunt is going to be probably around 14 miles, 14 to 20 miles, depending. If you don't find sheep, then you have to keep going and keep looking, unless you want to return home with no meat for your wife and children, and that's not usually an option.
Can you give one short story of this?
Of a hunt?
A time that you hiked out there.
And came home with something?
And came home alive.
Well, I'm sitting here.
Yeah.
I will generally boat up the river, and find a good spot to park my boat, since we do live on the edge of a large river. And then from there, I'll grab my gear and pack up and head out.
When's the last time you did that?
A Dall sheep hunt? Or just a hunt in general? Because I hunt generally all the time. I don't know that I ever stop hunting. My rifle is always close.
When's the last time you hiked and you were gone for, say, a couple days or a few days?
Probably in the winter sometime, actually. I go out in the winter a fair bit, trapping and hunting caribou. So we're in June now, so January, February, March.
And how do you survive the cold?
What cold? People like to think of the north as just this frozen wasteland. Yes, it gets cold, but we still have the 4 seasons. And winter is just something you take in stride. Your body somewhat adapts to it, but you use the right gear and tools that you need. And you just work around it, if you will. In the summertime, you have things to work around, such as mosquitoes or certain...
Yeah, you're telling me.
Mosquitoes are certain things, a hot sun, and you work with that. You find ways to, work in the morning and the evening instead of the middle of the day. And the winter is very similar. The snow and the frozen landscape enables us to get into territory that you could never get in any other time of the year. So it's very exciting. The hunting is different, but it's not, people like to think of it as just cold and it's just suffering and how could you do that? But we see it a lot differently. It's, thank God it's snowing. I'm going to have snow to run my skidoo on or pull my sleds and so on. Oh, it's very cold. Well, I know the river's going to freeze soon so I can cross it. And when I cross it, I am able to get into new force with new game perhaps. So that's how we look at it. We work with it, not against it. And it's necessary for our survival. If it didn't freeze, we could never cross the river in the winter, and we would be stuck not being able to get to our hunting and trapping grounds. If it didn't get cold, the animals wouldn't get the fur they need. Their fur wouldn't thicken to the degree where it makes a pelt very prime and valuable. for clothing and or for selling. So in the summertime, no one traps in the summertime because the fur is basically useless. It's the winter that makes them grow the fur, the insulation, if you will, that we need to survive.
And so you have the clothing to actually feel warm in the negative temperatures?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
What are they? What is it?
We do use some modern clothing that is developed, but less and less, like develop synthetics and things, but less and less as they don't seem to withstand the harsh environment. So I'm starting to transition a lot more into wool, canvas, and slowly towards fur. So totally natural. Caribou hide, which I'm currently working on one, tanning it up, and I plan to make a coat, is warmer, more durable, and a better outfit than the most expensive coat in the world that you could buy. So as we came up here, we came with a lot of things that you would find in whatever store down south that would be touted as the best and perhaps the most environmentally friendly or whatever. And we find it to be garbage and not work with the lifestyle we live in. So we've had to slowly change and move away from that.
What's the warmest footwear that you have?
The warmest footwear I have, which I actually think I have some sitting here, would be a pair of mucklucks. They are leather from a moose or a buffalo or whatever outer. And then we coat them with fur, which could be wolf. This is wolf here. But we'll coat them with fur and then put wool in the interior. And the whole idea, you could take a rubber or a synthetic thing and put wool or put something warm in it and, think it's going to keep you just as toasty out there, your feet just as toasty. But the whole idea with a muckluck is that the sole is flexible so it can bend, and that's what keeps your feet warm. It's not so much the insulation. Everyone thinks the more insulated my boot is, the warmer my foot will keep. But it's not that at all. You can have a very thin boot in a cold temperature with a sole that's flexible where you're connected to the land and you can feel the branches and you can feel the twigs as you step on them to a certain degree. And that flexing causes the blood in your feet to pump. And when you're sitting in a rubber boot all day or a hard-soled boot, it doesn't matter how much wool you have, you're going to start getting cold after a little while. And with much less insulation, but a flexible sole, you never get cold.
Wow. I think there might be some shoes that try to replicate that. The flexible sole. So I never thought of that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yes, and it's important even if you buy a shoe with a flexible sole that you're buying a non-synthetic material, a non-rubber, because not only is it important to have a flexible sole, but it's also important not to put a barrier between yourself and the Earth's magnetic field, if you will, or energy field, which is very important for your whole body as well.
Where'd you get the duck that's some kind of a bird is on the top of the foot area?
A native lady who does beading did that up. So the native, it's actually an eagle, and a native lady that does beading, they like to put designs and things on the moccasins and buckskins and so on. So they make really, really cool.
Called him eagle
stuff.
Duck. Oh man. Let's pivot a little bit now. So let's talk a little bit about the specific full-blown expeditions that you've done. Because I've seen pictures. Can you think of maybe 2 or 3 of the best ones that you've done? And just explain it with all the love that you can muster up for the North. Maybe starting with the least amazing. Save the best for last.
Well, if we were to go into 2 or 3 of them, we might be here for quite a while.
Let's start with one.
So we can get into one of them that is probably one of my favorites. And that is when I started coming north before I lived in the north. I was somewhat fascinated by geothermal activity because in areas where there's high geothermal, you get hot water. And I often thought how amazing it would be to find a hot spring in the wilderness and live next to it. It would just solve all your problems in the wintertime. So I started doing a lot of research in geothermal studies and looking at maps of the landscape where the activity was high. Now, people like to think that the whole world is just known and anything you can possibly think of, you know, people have been there or seen it. And to some extent that is true, but there are still lots of very amazing places you can go that see almost no humans and sometimes none at all. So I found this area in the northern part of one of our provinces that stretched into the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, and it had a lot of geothermal activity. So one day...
So what does that mean, geothermal?
Geothermal means that there's underground heat very close to the surface, which is basically an indicator that there could be hot springs in the area.
Okay.
So I decided after a lot of looking at maps and things that this one valley, very remote, off the Alaska Highway could possibly contain a hot spring.
How old were you when you did this one?
I was about between 19 and 21, I think. I can't remember my exact age.
And how long was it total?
It was about 2 weeks.
So 2 weeks.
Off in
with
the wilderness,
a backpack.
traveling, backpack.
Did you ever stop for food or?
Well, we ate as we go, packed food with us. But
What happened when you ran out of food?
well, we never ran out of food, and we
Okay.
did have guns and means of procuring more, like hooks and fishing line.
Okay.
So traveled as close as we could get by road to this site, and then from there was another about 20 miles off the highway, and we were walking up this river, which was absolutely just stunning. There's mountains on all sides, long since left all human sign behind. And I remember distinctly this creek coming off this mountain, and I was very thirsty, so I took a drink, and it was ice cold. And it was very refreshing. And then we hiked another 4 or 5 kilometers, and another creek was coming, and it was a very hot day, so I thought, I'm going to go get another drink. So just like the previous creek, I ran up to it and plunged my face and hands into it. And lo and behold, it wasn't cold water as it should have been, as all the water in rivers were ice cold. It was hot. So that was very exciting, and that's how I first discovered this hot spring, is by this creek that was running out of it into the river we were traveling.
How hot was the water?
It was not too hot to touch. It was about bathtub temperature.
Okay. So not lukewarm. It was hot.
In between lukewarm and hot. It was quite nice, very pleasant to jump into. So, of course, I traveled up this creek, and it came up on top of this plateau, and on the top of this plateau was a lake of turquoise color, just mesmerizingly beautiful, about an acre in size, with a little bit of a geyser, not quite a geyser, but sort of something coming up in the middle, a lot of bubbles and activity. And the plateau was just all sort of sandy, and on one side were cliffs where there was hot water cascading down off the cliffs. And it was just in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't believe something like that existed, and there was no tourist facility there or, some sort of park or anything else. It was just sitting there for me to enjoy all by myself or with the people I was with no sign of human activity. And I was very excited about that expedition, so it actually led me to my favorite expedition of all time. And that is when I was returning back home from that expedition, I met an old fellow who told me about a mystical tropical valley, which he said was in the area, but a fair distance away from where I described to him I had found this first hot spring. And he said that this tropical valley had hundreds of hot springs, and grizzly bear were soaking in them every day, and that it was very prolific wildlife and mountains all around and tropical flowers. So of course I thought, he's a little bit out to lunch, but he said he had seen it, that him and his dad had gone in on horseback into the wilderness, and they had found it when he was about 11 years old, and he had never been back since. But he swore by it, so I got to studying maps, and I found a location about 40 to 50 kilometers from my last expedition where there was a valley, and the geothermal activity was off the maps. It was just crazy, off the charts. So I mounted an expedition in there, and that has become one of my favorite places in the world. And it's very hard to describe with people, and I'm not going to say what it's called, because it actually is on a map now, and if a person did enough digging, you could find it, although you could probably never get there. If you want to know the location, you're going to have to contact me, and we can go in together. But it's about 60 miles off the nearest highway. There's no roads, no services, nothing. The grizzly bears in there are as thick as mosquitoes. So I went in there, and when we got in, we actually took a helicopter part of the way and landed on a river, and then we hiked in from there. And as we were hiking up this river, we came into the valley, and it was just as the old man had described. There were hundreds of hot springs in about a mile-long stretch, and they were coming out of the banks everywhere of the river. And they were forming pools of every sort of temperature, from absolutely boiling hot where it just scalded you to the perfect soaking temperature. And they were making all these channels through the ground, and everywhere we went in there, it was just very, very beautiful. No sign of any humans having ever been there before us. It was very, very remote. Lots of wildlife. So I spent about a week in there. And during that week, about a week.
Hot tubbing for a week?
Hot tubbing for a whole week and just taking in the sights. During that week, one of our favorite places was there was so much water mixing with the river in one spot where there was all these boulders and rapids that it was hot there, and you could go and put your feet up against a boulder and move in any direction and you get a different temperature. So you could go over this way a little bit, it would be too hot, or you'd be, too hot, you'd want to get a little bit cooler, you'd move over this way into the cooler water, and you could keep going right into ice cold. So I would sit there, my feet backed up against the boulder, hot water just rushing over me, and I would fish grayling out of below the rapids and just reel them right in. And if I wanted to, I could just throw them in the hot pool and cook them. So it was really beautiful. We found some unbelievable caves, no sign that humans had ever been in them at all. And everywhere you looked, it was just stunning. And to think that that exists in today's world and nobody knows about it, and probably very, very few people have ever seen it, is quite amazing.
What time of year was this again?
July.
Okay. What was the vegetation like? Was it like palm tree paradise, or?
The vegetation was quite lush. There were a lot of places where there were tall ferns, and you got to remember this is in the north, close to the 60th parallel. And yet we found cedar, we found tall ferns, we found a lot of yellow monkey flower, which is a sort of tropical flower that wouldn't grow anywhere else, but was obviously growing because of the hot water. It was very beautiful and very green.
We gotta describe that a little bit more. Did it feel like a tropical place?
It did.
Or almost?
It felt almost like I wasn't on Earth anymore. It's hard to describe the valley. The valley in places had cliffs, 1,000 feet high, and there's mountains towering over you. The banks of the river in places were very steep, and it was just very, very wild. It was totally normal to wake up in the morning and see a grizzly bear, walking up and down the river, or moose, or caribou. And it was almost like I was intruding on some sort of place that humans maybe weren't even meant to be.
Sounds like Narnia.
Very similar.
You been there once?
I've been there once. I've mounted 2 more expeditions to return, both of which have failed.
Why?
It's very difficult to get in there. You have to have quite a high skill level in survival tactics in the wilderness, and just a degree of self-sufficiency that most people would be like, well, I go camping, I'm self-sufficient, but okay, you go camping and you're self-sufficient. This is on a whole other level. There's no services, there's no support, and the landscape is incredibly rugged.
And you said about 60 miles?
About 60 miles to get in there if you were to hike, and you can get part of the way in driving down an old trail, perhaps 5 miles, and then you have to park, and from there it's just bushwhacking on moose and bear and buffalo trails. But I have tried to get back in 2 more times, and there's probably not a day that goes by where I don't think about it. The whole area is heavily treed, and then there's this big valley about 30 miles long, I would say, and it's like the plains of Saskatchewan, just wide open, and you can spot herds of caribou walking around and glass with your binoculars and see all kinds of wildlife right next to the hot springs. And then all around you is heavy trees, and on one side mountains. It's absolutely spectacular. But best of all, it's not developed. There's no sign of humans. It's just wild. It's just you. And that's what appeals to me. I can't stand going to resorts or places where there's nothing left of nature. And there's people everywhere, and it's just a whole different feeling. It's a world-class, if you will, wilderness destination, in my opinion, that nobody knows about. I'm definitely willing, though, to take people in. You pay for the trip, and I'll guide you, protect you, and give you what you need to get there.
Was this the most beautiful place you've ever seen?
By far. And I spend a lot of time exploring and seeing a lot of beautiful places. But this place was something above the rest, something really special.
So you even compare it to these amazing images of Jasper National Park, Banff, Yellowknife.
Jasper and Banff
or
are
Yellowstone, Yellowknife.
They're quite beautiful, but they're very developed, which has almost drawn some of their beauty out, in my opinion. And that ruggedness is kind of gone. It's also a mental, beauty is in the mind, and it's also a mental idea. And when you're out there and it's just you, it's just the wilderness, it's just this rugged territory, it's a whole different sort of feeling. And that really adds to the beauty of it, the adventure of it. You're seeing these vents, these hot springs that pretty much no one's ever seen, that have been pumping hot water out of the ground and building formations and mounds and, all kinds of really amazing scenery for thousands of years, if you will. And it's very hard to go somewhere in the world today and see something as it may have been thousands of years ago, because everything is more or less being sort of touched or developed or changed by humankind. So to see something like that special and that pristine, as it was probably 1,000 years ago, is pretty neat.
What did the grizzlies think of your being there?